Hey Chris, I'm gonna start by saying that you got me smiling with this week's on ramp, and that it was a steep, steep, steep on ramp. But here we are broadcasting, um, and it's Sunday morning because yesterday was a crazy busy morning for me. So I appreciate that you were flexible enough to let this happen today instead of yesterday. How are you doing?
I'm good. It was funny because I was poised over sending you a very similar text. No joke. The the weekend got, I guess, packed up kind of quick, but just in a very sort of short span of time. So we have some pretty good friends up this way. We lived beside each other, and then we kind of both moved out of a neighborhood together. We had kids kind of at the same time, so they've become sort of our local anchors, so to speak, to the point where my kids accidentally yesterday called them their cousins. And so it's cool growth, eh? Like, and that was just spontaneous. I was like, and I was, you go to their, and I'm like, oh, what is a cousin? Like it's that sort of that line, and we just let it ride. But my daughter had a birthday party, a sleepover birthday party to go to on the Monday. My son had some other stuff going on, and then our friends asked, they were going out of town, and they asked if we could watch their kids. And Friday night I went to a PK session just to listen to some speakers. So it became all of a sudden our getting home from school, getting a little bit of food in the kids, going to get the friends' kids, which they ended up coming to our house first, so it was good, and then taking my daughter to the sleepover, and then coming back and still having 3 kids in the house. So there was sort of no game, right? And then they had the sleepover. Their kids stayed over, and then Saturday morning, me up in the morning making breakfast for the gang. It's just, so it worked out quite well. And then going to get my daughter coming back, playing with the 2 other kids, and then those, yeah. So it was one of those fun kind of family. It was blended family Friday. That's what it felt like. We got rid of 1, and then we gained 2, and then we got rid of 2, and our 1 came back. So kid rental. So it was good. It was a fun Saturday, and then we just kind of chilled in the afternoon.
I wanna comment on the word cousin and how people use that. It's interesting because it's a family term that many people use with close friends, and I love that it's a cousin is someone who's not tightly related but related enough that there's the connection. So as soon as you say to somebody, "Oh, that's my cousin," it's like a free pass. Like, oh, they're connected to him, but loose enough that it's still serious, but tight enough that it's like, what's the word I'm looking for? That it's acceptable. It's hard to explain, but growing up, I had a lot of those too. Like people who would live really close, who were of the same ethnicity, by the way. So it's not like the white dude down the street was calling me cousin. We'd meet up with people and they say, "Oh, how do you know him?" And they'd be like, "Oh, he's my cousin." And so it's automatic street credit kind of thing, like, "Oh, he's a good guy." But we're not cousins. My parents just know each other. They've known each other for years. So I don't know, when you said that, it made me laugh. It brought back a lot of ethnic memories, so to speak, growing up with not a lot of other people from my culture living in the neighborhood kind of thing. So thanks for taking me down memory lane.
I like that in the words. So what's your heritage again? I forget. Syrian?
No, Lebanon, Middle
Lebanon.
East.
In the word for cousin, does it have connotation like what you're talking about right now? Like if you were back in Lebanon and there was that same loose affiliation with someone that was just close to your family but not of blood, would you say, and forgive me, so in Lebanon the language is Lebanese? So yes. Would you say in Lebanese, "That's my cousin," or is there a different word that you would say for "that's just a really close friend that our family calls family but is not really family and has street credit"?
That's a good question, and I can't answer it because I don't even know how to say cousin or maybe I did and I've forgotten. I don't know. I'm thinking right now and it's not coming to me. But what's funny about that, what you said is when you ask that question, I take myself out of the Canada Roland and I put myself into the Middle Eastern Roland. And I don't know if you noticed, but I kind of chuckled because over there, I imagine everybody just walks around calling everybody cousin. Like nobody has any friends in Lebanon. They're all cousins because it's it's kind of like an honor. Instead of saying, "Oh, this is my buddy," you make it seem tighter to show respect. "Oh, this is my cousin." So everybody's walking around saying, "This is my cousin. This is my cousin." That's what I visualize. It's what I imagine. I'm sure that's not how it works. I wish I could answer your question, but I can't.
I get fascinated by it. I was listening to there's a cool podcast called The Hidden Brain, and as I was driving back from the that Pekachka or Pechakucha, depending on how you know it, the speaker series that I went to just on Friday, they were talking about language, and they started off specifically talking about gendered language, and as in there are languages in the world that have neutral nouns, and then there's other ones that are specifically gendered, and you have to make the agreements in order to speak effectively there. And they talked about how that changes your worldview. And if they said it's a really cool loop that they were analyzing, that in order to understand the world fully, you need language to describe it, but in describing it, it changes your worldview. And here's the example that they used, is that they did these test conversations in groups where there is gendered nouns, and they asked the groups, people in the groups, to, for example, act out, for example, the days of the week. So if the day of the week had to have a feminine agreement with it, then when they were acting out that day of the week, they were presenting stereotypical female attributes in that characterization. And conversely, masculine, let's say. They did another test where they said, they looked at writing and art, and in the spaces where the iconography in it, for example, the word liberty in some languages is noted as a feminine word. And then they look at the iconography that comes out of it, and it's typically female. So it's fascinating to sort of look at that kind of shift and how powerful language could be. As I'm asking you, in Lebanon, do people say, that's my cousin? And again, like I said, it's that connection that's just close, but not really family. But you don't want to insult the person by saying you're not family, so you call it family, right? All those sort of, it makes me think about that preoccupation that North Americans have with saying bro. And if that would be misinterpreted in the exact way, well, what does bro mean? Brother. That person's your brother, but they don't look anything like you. And, whether it's color or hair or facial stuff, like, how can that be? And I think maybe that's the equivalent of cousin in some ways, because I have heard that before with, my part of my heritage is Irish and the other half is Polish. And in Polish, it wasn't as specific as saying cousin, but there was that affinity where you would sort of jump the queue and become part of the family. But then you would be called family, at least from what mine was. You didn't actually put that in betweener. Cousin already had the strong connection of being blood. And there was one occasion where someone had adopted, and again, I'm just speaking from my context. So there were children that were adopted in after the fact, and it took a while for them to become cousins. They were just known by name. They didn't quite get in right away. Yeah, no joke. It was, I can remember this was one of the family members that this happened with. They didn't immediately ascend into that designation. Yeah. So bro, cousin, whatever it is. And you know what, you're going to get off air and you're going to talk to someone like, what is the name for like cousin in Lebanese? We could probably Google it. Google save us in this one. But the power of words, eh? Is there masculine? Okay, so I'm probing now. Is there masculine and feminine agreements in Lebanese?
I would say yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. The whole thing's interesting. The whole thing. I've always had difficulty dealing with the two, like dealing with my Middle Eastern heritage and my Canadian upbringing, always. And I'm not really sure why. I guess I could sit down and think about that for a while, but there's always been a disconnect between the two. I've not been able to harmonize them as well as I would like. So I don't know. It's weird.
You remember? I remember a story you told about the professor.
Yes. The, one of the all-time favorites, the
That's a good
professor.
one. Because
Yeah.
yeah, like, and anyone jumping in, it's a little bit of it's a similar example of giving someone a designation um that I guess on one level someone might disagree with. It's like, no, or at least your new understanding of what that word could mean is you're bound to one definition. We're not going to let it float at all. No, a professor means it's a several degreed individual that is at university. You don't just get that because you're the smartest person in the town or the smartest person on the block.
Well, can I throw a layer on that? I mean,
Yeah,
I'm not
totally.
okay. I'm not going to tell the story because I'm just not. But okay, so I'll give you some context in terms of, they're close family friend of my uncle's, who people referred to as the professor. And now that I know Seinfeld, it kills me because in Seinfeld, they had a lot of fun with that, right? Like with different people, and it reminds me of the Maestro in one of the episodes. There's this guy that they called the Maestro, and Jerry was like, "Why is everybody calling this guy the Maestro?" But anyway, so close family friend, everybody called him the professor. And whatever, like I'm a kid, and at the time, I can recall now at the time, I was attaching that term to university, and being a young person, I was thinking, will I go to university? On and on we go. So I finally get to university, and I'm working my tail off here, right? And I'm meeting instructors who have been academics, like they've never been anything else. They've only ever been an academic. They've got doctorates and stuff. And then one day I questioned my mom about the professor and find out, to my mom's knowledge, that he has no like real formal education in terms of like achieving a doctorate or a master's degree or anything. And that's when I kind of like, I was the bomb in the family where I just like exploded this idea. Why are we calling this guy the professor? That, I've been in university for like 2 years and I'm dying here trying to like learn this stuff and do well and whatever. And you guys are walking around calling this dude a professor. Like I don't get it. Anyway, so I've always had a lot of fun with that. I don't know if my mom thinks it's funny. I think she laughed a couple of times at the beginning of this whole rant, but I don't know if she does anymore. I've never talked to my uncle about it. I just remember bits and pieces, like when my dad was still alive and they would refer to this man, my dad would always have this smirk on his face. And now I know why, right? And my dad was not a formally educated person, but even my dad knew, you guys are calling this dude a professor. He's an English teacher for government workers or whatever it turned out being. He's not a professor, right? So it is that term of respect, because I remember when I got married, my relatives from Lebanon came to Canada. And when people would ask them what I did for a living, they would tell them that I was a professor. And so I had to clear that up quickly. I had to say, no, 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 I'm not a professor. I'm an elementary school teacher. And here's the difference from, our perspective here in North America. So I appreciate the respect, right? But what you're doing is you're turning me into something bigger than what I am. And some poor little kid over there will grow up one day and discover that his uncle Roland or cousin Roland was a fake. He was never really a professor. He was like a grade 4 teacher. You know what I'm saying? So I was just kind of weaving between the two cultures and say, thank you for the respect you're showing me. But like in real life, that's not what I do. So let's just put it out there now. So if you want to keep respecting me, awesome. But define that for people, right? You can say, oh, he's a professor. He teaches 8-year-olds or whatever, and then let them do what they want with that. But anyway, the professor reminds me of a Seinfeld episode. Could have been a Seinfeld episode. That's my claim to fame, I guess. Anyway,
it's so okay. So here's jumping into school culture. Then, how do you see yourself in regards to terms like teacher, educator, co-learner, lead learner? How concrete are those terms for you? Because like your dad, like that example, say your dad just like shaking his head, and I've seen that. It's totally, I love those moments. You know what? It's the Seinfeld moment, but it's also, that's very much a the Office moment. And you'll know the Office moment. Like I do this all the time with my students in class. I'll crack a joke. I'll say something. So someone will say something to me. I'll say something, whether it's just, a little bit juicy or a little bit sarcastic, a little bit kind of really cut and dry, but it's quippy. Like it's too quick for it to be the real answer. And then what I'll do is I know that I might be talking to someone here, and then I'll say the thing. And then that person is just sort of kind of trying to figure it out. And then I'll turn and I'll look at someone else in the class and I'll be like, and then I'll go back and I'll look at the person again. And I love those moments in teaching where some of the students are hearing different things, right? Someone's watching you, someone's watching the words. So that student you're talking to, I've spoke to a couple other teachers about this, a bit almost like your classroom can sometimes be like mini Post-it notes. And you're giving each kid just a little bit of information in order to move that activity forward. Because if you just kind of blast it, someone could miss part of the lesson or miss part of the activity. So I love giving kids just little pieces of what we're about to do, and then help them find each other to tie it together. And kind of jokes in class can be like that as well, because someone in the class can feel like they're getting the lesson, they're figuring it out, you've given them exactly what they need. And then someone else is like, I can't even believe that this is strange. How does that story even work? So you got some kids cracking up and some kids writing the task. So your dad just shaking his head, that's like him in an episode of The Office, just looking right into the camera and, staring right into your eyes. You're like, I love it. And so, your culture of your school, I swing that. And now I swing that way trying to, I don't know if I'm concrete on calling myself a teacher. That feels like the designation that I have to say. My OCT, I'm a teacher, I'm certified in the trade of teaching, whatever that is. But then you get into educator, and then depending on the collaborative space, it might be called co-learner. And then depending if it's a collaborative space, but then we have to call someone the teacher or the leader, but we don't want to say teacher or leader because that's too leadery. So then we say lead learner. And you hear these words being bounced around in a lot of different PLN language. And I've never gotten into really great conversations. I sometimes make them indistinguishable from each other. What do you do with them? How do you see that? Do you find yourself code switching like that? Like depending on who you're talking to, you call yourself a teacher or an educator, or I'm an academic that happens to work with elementary school teachers. Oh, really? Oh, yes. Yes, working on self-regulation and language skills. You sort of go into your professore voice. How concrete is that for you? How do you see yourself?
It's funny when you started down that road, the idea for me right away, it took me to what my students are doing currently. And I call them my students. Some people would argue they're not my students, but the kids under my care every day.
Sorry, they're your co-learners.
You know what? I'm looking at the camera, Chris.
Oh, sorry. There's the Office. Exactly.
Listen, for me, it's about what's happening with my kids right now. So my kids right now, the students I work with right now at this day and time, they are not doing well with me being a lead learner. Okay, so right now I'm their teacher, and I've been operating that way for the past few weeks, and we've been having a lot of conflict. And so, you know, maybe somebody out there with way more experience in education or someone with a new idea could step up and help me out. Because right now, I'm their classroom teacher. Picture 1985, if you can, and that's how I'm operating. Because um, they're not doing well. They don't need a lead learner right now, so to speak. They don't need um, the guide from the side. Okay. Right now they need the sage on the stage for whatever reason. That model seems to be working. And hey, I'm no sage. That's the problem, right? Like right now I'm in the traditional teacher role. Lots of a whole group stuff. Then I split them up into smaller group stuff and circulate the room. Like a lot of how I'm operating right now with the students I work with is I'm the guy in charge, and I'm the one providing opportunities and giving them permission, um, to do group work and stuff like that. I don't know why. I've even talked to the colleagues in my building. See, your question has set me off in a different direction, because last year and the year before, I was more of a lead learner. I was more of like, okay, here's this idea, and here's where we need to get to in terms of like the learning goals and the success criteria. How do you want to do it? There was more consultation. There was more openness and freedom. Right now, that's not happening in my room. It's just not. So, and I'm working on it. So for all the people out there that are living in 2018, don't get me wrong. I'm not wanting to stay in 85, but I'm taking the bits and pieces from 85 that seem to really meld well with the group I have in front of me. So there's my soapbox. I'm going to get off now, and I'm going to tell you that right now I call myself a classroom teacher. I'm steering the ship. I'm running the show, generally speaking. And then within that culture, there are lots of moments to set people free, to let them operate in a way that works for them, that allows them to get to where we need to be. But I feel like an old school teacher with a strong hold on the boundaries in the room and what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and then slowly bumping up against those boundaries with particular students that are showing me that they can operate that way responsibly. I don't know if any of that makes sense, but that's how I would define myself at the moment.
No, that does make sense. I think that there's something really intoxicating about using the open language of learning as if everybody is you ever watch the show Little House on the Prairie? Do you remember that from back in the day? So you remember that lead on Little House on the Prairie where the Ingalls kids are all running down the flowery grassy slope, and they got the big smiling faces on, and they're just loving running, and then one of them trips, and you see them kind of and then they stand back up and they keep running, but they keep running. And that I get that picture. That picture comes to mind sometimes with the uber flexibility suggested by words like co-learner and lead learner. And when we try to differentiate between guide on the side and sage on the stage, there's a lot of things that kind of crack off on this. I too am a product. I've written about my and I've thought a lot about my experience of being in high school in the 80s. So I was in there between 1985 and 1989, and having the moments of flashback where I'm standing in my classroom, and it's more, for me, it becomes more about where I stand in my classroom and I realize the class design. So I actually start with the physical space, just kind of clicks off, and I feel like I'm back in my high school again. So then you have this like 30-year stretch of time travel where school design hasn't changed so fundamentally that I've actually forgotten, or we've completely let go of old styles. Yesterday I was talking to my own kids, so we got a video. They signed a video game out of the library, and it plays natively on a PS3. So my kids have a PS3 that they play with on. That's kind of the game of choice they love right now. So the game in itself, the title, the series started on the PS2. And what I got them over Christmas is, because the PS2 that's an older system. I don't have a PS2, but what I bought those games, and they're ported up. They'll play on the PS3, so it's just on the hard drive. And it's interesting for them to watch it because some of the cutscenes move back into square. So it's a smaller screen design. And what they've been able to do for the gameplay, they've been able to upscale it in such a way that in the gameplay, it's the full wider screen. But on the cutscenes, it's back to the original. I'm guessing that there's something about the code that you can't expand it. So it plays not natively, but they can't make it much better. And they didn't think much of it at the time, but I used it to explain the difference in TVs now, the rectangular versus the square design that they used to be. But then I started to think about the purpose in having that disappear. I would say putting the two side by side, it is a better view to see something on a rectangular screen. I mean, that's what movie screens were. It was like you had two different systems existing at the same time. You would see a movie in widescreen-ish, and then you'd go home and you'd watch a square TV. So it was a smart kind of harmonizing of two different ways of thinking. And then the one beta kind of fell away, and then you just have the other version. So in talking about that, using that example, and they're like, okay, so they kind of understood. Daddy, can we just play the game? Stop talking, little lesson in the middle of the library. And then, we think about the school system, and standing in class and thinking about what you're looking at is 30 years old. And if you're looking at something that's 30 years old, that can be a problem. Absolutely, that can be a problem, especially if the room design, I remember, and we kind of go back to where we started in this conversation, if the room design has conditions and rules that define how you do other things. So you can be given a completely blank space in a classroom that just so happens to be built in the 1980s, but as a blank canvas, you feel like you can go in any direction. If you start to put in the pieces from 1985, that may include also the pedagogy, then you get into a weird space, because then, you're just recreating the whole joke all over again, right? And somebody is going to walk in and stand in your doorway and do this in the doorway. They're going to be looking at the camera again and going, dude, like, you just got out of faculty and somehow you've made a classroom look like 1985 again. How have you done that? So I wrestle with the idea that the language in itself, teacher, educator, co-learner, lead learner, and the power of the culture of what it's asking of you, I totally get with what you're doing with your kids. And I think about that in my context with some of the students that some students that are suspended or expelled, they arrive fully equipped and understanding what I would say is current thinking on education. They are comfortable with using blended learning. They are comfortable using the G Suite tools. They are completely cognizant of, okay, now I'm going to do some digital work. Now we need to do active work, and then group design, collaborative. We're going to do all these sort of active, up on our feet activities. Some students arrived fully equipped, like they've read my PLN feed in Twitter. They know all the current stuff. Then there's other students that arrive and they need, like you said, they need that, what I feel to be the authoritarian. I have to be in the class and I have to say, I'm going to hyper-schedule you. I'm going to deregulate some of your old ways by working on your self-regulation. And I'm going to make sure that you understand that it's not just you and I right now in this space, but your parents or guardians as well need to play a role. So your independence, your sort of power of being an independent learner, I have to tweak a little bit. And I'm fascinated, where I started with this is that power of what the local culture asks of you. And in the code switching, I do the shake my head when it seems like the code switching is of convenience, depending on who we're talking to. And in your case, I think one of the powers of being, how many years in are you teaching? 15 years?
17.
17 years. So you are authoritative in the way that you can speak to this right now, because there's somebody listening to the podcast who just went to a session on don't be the sage on the stage, be the guide on the side, and is completely, like, how have I never thought of this before? Wow, this is going to be amazing in the classroom. I think if you step through that, then you kind of pop out and you say, okay, there will be times when. There will be times when I can't go back to my class and start doing it. If I were to go back on Monday and just open up that opportunity altogether, some of my students would rise to it, because they've been slowly trained in that style. Others, and you and I have talked about this as well, that either have forgotten what it means to be a student, or maybe are still wrestling with the fact that they are a student. It's an identity thing. They haven't had enough time exposure. Like, there's a whole lot of reasons why a kid would be in a classroom and look at it not like a classroom. It's a play space, it's whatever. But for those students, I need to maintain that sort of area of rigor for them. So it's less about the curriculum. It's more about helping them stay effective in their day. And the shake my head part is where I think there's too much code switching. There's too much code switching, because it's not the same. It's not the same. And I could go and do a talk at some school about the importance of open pedagogy and trying to create a creative space. And if the culture at that school has a high percentage of, let's say, teachers, not thinkers, like they are co-learners, or even the idea of lead learner, if that doesn't exist there, then I think the idea starts to fall apart. And I'm not trying to be pessimistic. It kind of comes down to know your students, know your audience, and the power of the words, because it does come with definitions. We can't just make them, and that's why I kind of laugh at the lead learner. Like, that's borderline oxymoronic to me. It is. Because if you're the learner, for me, hey, looking at the camera, yo, right? There's an oxymoronic. It's not a paradox. It's actually it's jumbo shrimp. How do you sort of say you're the leader but not the leader? And I've talking with people, they say it's the sip aside, it's the lead from a side. Okay, sure. But what are we really talking about? And I wrestle with that. And it's not like I have to make it absolute. And this is a really long kind of rant kind of thing, but I get how you can really be either brainwashed, confused, or frustrated by trying to self-identify as an educator, and not necessarily finding the space to be able to say, you know what, last week I was this guide on the side. This week I am the sage on the stage. Next week I will be a parent. Oh, wait a second. I need to go be a lead learner right now with my teachers, because I have to give a PD session. So that code switching it's powerful, but it's also slightly stupefying. I constantly wrestle with that. So I know what conversation I'm in. I have to be honest. I grab from that information, so I know not only who am I talking to right now, but what's our actual conversation about. I'll take a sip.
Okay. I think the code switching for the sake of code switching is what you and I are kind of like poo-pooing right now. I would, that's what I'm inferring, right? But code switching is important, because that fluidity, if it's authentic, and if your heart's in the right place, that fluidity, that being able to shift depending on the situation, what your audience needs, that's important, right? So when you were saying that there at the end, there have been times this year where my students are in the middle of an inquiry, and being the guide on the side is exactly what they needed during that time. But, there are times where they need the sage on the stage as well. And that this is what I'm seeing. And I'm constantly learning. Every teacher is. So the lead learner thing, yeah, I get where you're coming from. I just think you just have to know who you're working with. You have to know what they need. And every teacher, educator has different priorities. One of my main priorities is that what I'm working with, like my classroom environment or my teaching space or the learning space I'm in, it needs to have some hard boundaries. Like it needs to have a perimeter that I'm comfortable with and that the students can live with, or else why am I there? Right? Like we're all different. Okay. We're all humans. We're all different. And there are some things I need to feel good about where I'm at and what I'm doing. Just like the kids need to feel comfortable and they need to feel like they're getting what they need. And that's part of my role. And so right now I'm just being really honest about that and saying that, like you said, there are some kids that need like a hyper schedule, right? Like they need me to be micromanaging them in order to help them. My goal would be to help them learn to be able to manage their self by the end. I'll like take the lead so that I'm not the one leading. They're more taking the lead on what they need, knowing what they need, and then being successful using those things. So I'm just at a point where it doesn't matter what the people around me are saying. It does and it doesn't. Like there's a lot of noise. I can't operate like the person down the hall who has a completely different dynamic in their learning space than I do. It makes no sense. It's like people trying to mimic certain things that I might do, thinking that they're going to find similar results mimicking what I do. Well, that's not how it works. You might have a class that's not open to what it is that you want to try, or they might not be ready, right? Like there might be things that need to happen first in order to work your way up to something. So I don't know. I think I've always said that too in presentations I've done. This has been my lived experience, what I'm about to talk to you about and show you. And it's been really cool. That's why I'm here, because what I'm about to share with you is really magical. Like it's felt, for me as the educator, it's felt great to be able to go on a particular journey. And my students showed success. So it all depends. When I listen to people, when I read tweets from the edu gurus, if you will, I read it and then I do what I want with it. I reflect on it. I analyze it. I think about it. I talk to people about it. Then I go from there. I don't walk into my room every Monday with a brand new plan on what's going to work. I walk in and I do my best to read my audience, to see where we're at, to see where we can go, to listen to their thoughts and kind of work on melding everything together so that's a reasonable learning space so that people feel satisfied, people feel heard. I'll give you a quick example. One of my parents, I just found out one of my parents at school is responsible for putting together the yearbook page for my class. And that's really exciting. So we're putting together a yearbook at the school, and parents were asked to volunteer to help out to do all the back end stuff. And I'm fortunate enough to say that one of the parents, like one of the students in my room, her mom is doing our thing, which is kind of cool. It's always nice to have a parent that's already in your classroom learning community participate, because they already kind of know how things operate or whatever. And the mom and I were going back and forth talking about how we could involve the kids. And again, for me right now, it's a bit of a touchy subject because, you know, somebody says, hey, we're doing this, we want to involve the students. It's like, great idea. But depending on what the involvement is at this particular time might not work. Or I may just say, I don't think this is happening right now. I don't feel like this is going to happen right now. And so, which sucks, because it's when somebody says that they want to be involved in your class, you don't want to say no. Like that's not, I don't feel good saying no. But again, I cannot be influenced by, you know, what's really nice and neat in the world. I need to be influenced by what's going to work for these kids, what's going to keep them moving in a direction that I believe is beneficial to them. So the mom and I are kind of not negotiating, just talking like, well, what's our plan? What do we want to do? And so one of the ideas that my parent came up with was, well, okay, let's get a theme. Talk to your kids about a theme that they want for their page. And so I said, that's easy. So I sat down with the kids and I said, this is what's happening. it'd be really cool if our page had a theme. And so let's brainstorm some ideas, then let's vote. And it worked really nicely, right? But I was running the ship. I was the one putting things on the board. I was the one like talking to the kids about how this would work or whatever. And it's funny because at the end, we got a theme from 2018, not from 1985, right? So it's funny, there were some like 1990 references or whatever, and they weren't voted on. And that's just the way it goes. But it's really neat for me to switch and to take what they're giving me and to go with that. You know what I'm saying? So sometimes I put things out there for them and they don't bite. And so I have to stop, check my ego and kind of be like, okay, they're not buying this. They're not interested in this. I think you and I talked last week about coding and some of the coding work my kids are doing. They've really like taken to it. Okay. So we're finishing up our second coding assignment. And again, I have to say, it's not really about the coding. The coding is the bonus, but nobody's complaining anymore. Everybody's helping each other. And in that space, when we're doing that work, I am a guide on the side. I am a resource person. I have no problem with that role because they're showing me that I can be in that role and things are going to run smoothly. But in other areas, you've got me really reflecting now that in other spaces in the room with respect to other types of learning and content, they are not ready for me to step aside. I need to be standing at the top, delegating, instructing, modifying. And so this business of being one thing, I don't think any of the gurus would say that being one thing is what they're trying for us to become. I think that it's just, there are lots of concepts and ideas about how to operate. And from my perspective, and for a new person and even an older person in education, I think it's still important that we know and understand these things that are happening, these ways of being with the kids. And then the trick is, the wisdom is in knowing when to turn one on and turn one off, right? Like that's the trick. Like I told you with the coding right now, my kids are on fire. They're doing a lot of their own learning, and I'm on the side, and I'm making sure when I check in with them that what I want to happen at the end of this is what's going on. And the vehicle to get them there is the coding, and it's good. But then, we put that away, and the next thing you know, I've got all kinds of issues because students are working on something else and they're not prepared, which is kind of my problem, or they're just not wanting to operate in a particular way that's civil in the space that we're in. And I need to kind of be in there a lot. I need to step in a lot. And that's exhausting. That code switching for me is exhausting, but it's also what gives the room life. It's also why I can say that I enjoy my work, because it's that switching. But I don't switch just for fun. I don't just give them a new task or an inquiry question and then pretend like, oh, now I'm the guide. Sometimes I can't be the guide. Sometimes that's not what they need, even though they're working on something that's completely open for them to discover. There's my rant.
No, that's good. That's good. I think I've sat. So yeah, I think I've been at least one or two staff meetings where sometimes a little bit of the shaming happens too, and I've been a part of that idea where if you're still teaching like you're in the 80s, there's something wrong with you. And I'll say I'm guilty. I mean, part of that was me trying to figure out what it meant when I participated in that, yes, we shouldn't use any of those tools. It's like 1980, like somehow modern learning should just be as of yesterday. And if you're not that current, then you're not in the current. You're somehow doing something wrong. And I think part of my exploration of that was trying to balance what my so trying to balance what my past experiences in education were, so how I learned as a kid, and then putting on the scale, because teaching is not my first career, so putting on the scale what I've come to understand about industry and going to work, and then on the scale as well, somehow playing a evangelist slash advocate slash resistor to try and get the system moving faster than it really can. And somewhere in that confusion, I know on it more than one occasion, I've probably misstepped or put my foot in my mouth in somehow suggesting that all the old ways and knowledge should be just burn it down and start over, because that's not rational or reasonable. And to that end, and to come to awareness when you sort of realize that you may be playing a part in that shame game, then it's important then to step back and open up to conversations about exactly what we're doing right now, where there's time and place, and the broader your toolkit and the deeper your toolkit, both of those are important. It's not just a matter of having multi-tools that are just all on the top shelf of whatever your toolkit is. You want to have that staggered down as well, as in that single tool that might be that first simple response that can get great, like that. It's the equivalent of, how many times when you're trying to get your kids ready to go in the morning, is it as simple as saying, all right, kids, let's go, and boom, they're by the front door? Come on, really, as a parent, doesn't happen, And I've had colleagues that don't have children mention, I'll tell a story about just trying to get one of my kids to get their breakfast done, something they're completely developmentally able to do. And I go, and it turns into a story that has all of the plot twists of any, Netflix movie out there right now. And by the time I end up telling the story, my colleague is like, oh my God, I can't wait to hear your next story about getting your kids to eat breakfast. Come on. It's just a story I told about eating breakfast. But it never happens on the first try. And that's the difference between having the one tool that activates the exact behavior that you need, and having not only, if this tool very quickly figuring out, and maybe this is the code switching, it's that top set of tools, and knowing whether or not that first front simple provocation will work, or you need to jump to the next tool down in that kit, something that's a little bit more. So you're still in the same category, but dropping down into your toolkit, or jumping to the next category and saying, I can use the top one from this drawer, but over here, I got to go down to here. And that completely betrays that idea that somehow we should burn down all the old skills and just be modern learners. So I like the broadness of this discussion, and I love it creates a lot of ambiguity still. I mean, there's no answer yet as to how you see yourself specifically or how I see myself specifically, other than time and place and the need of the culture that you're working with. You have to be able to switch through. And I would probably step more. I think this type of conversation needs to happen as well in schools, where, because you will have very, very highly, deeply skilled individuals at the table that will self-identify as a teacher and will never, ever identify as the guide on the side, just for the looseness and ambiguity. And then you'll have others that will say they are the guide on the side because they absolutely need to keep that as wide open as possible. So, how they're sort of like, the badge that they're wearing is saying, I am this person. I'm going to completely kind of embrace it. And I'm starting to fall somewhere in the middle ground, say, depending on what I need to do and achieve and who I'm working with, I have to understand all of those possibilities just so we can sort of make it through the class or the conversation or the staff meeting. So, and it's easy if you look to Twitter. I mean, some of that shame game or blame game, or shame and blaming, however you want to say it, there is a whole lot of that can be blasted in any digital PLN, where people are, in some ways. So, here's my kind of take on it. I really liked, there was a conversation that popped up. Here's a good example of this. There was a conversation that popped up, it might have been last year, where one of our colleagues put out to the Twitter sphere about the potential harm that standardized testing can do to students. And that was a very, I think, a very specific part of their belief system, but a very specific kind of poke at standardized testing. But I think it was also provocative enough to get people talking, because my take on it is that our colleague was specifically does believe that it causes harm. Like this is, and then sort of tapped into there as well, that if we know something is causing our students harm, should we rise up and fight against it? So that was, I think I'm on point. Yeah, that's kind of how the conversation flowed. But I like that because I liked the conversation because it very specifically allowed for people to reveal their hands, because there were responses and then countermeasures to that response. So a response would have been, I'm going to play a part of the conversation. The countermeasures were a little bit more down the path of, how dare you sort of call that out as. So it became in defense of the thing that was said to be doing harm. And it had all the makings of, kind of an after school special, which sometimes Twitter conversations do. And you're left at the end, well, who do we side with? Is the bully the victim, or is the victim the bully? And then you have this really interesting dynamic in there that the idea is lost, right? It's like, well, what was at the heart of it there? What was the other possible discussion? Was there a third path, so to speak, to make it through this? So that sort of concept of individuals wanting to sort of hold their spaces and meeting in the middle is something that I'm constantly aware of. And maybe something like this podcast, or something like the writing, or, the speaking in public. I don't know if I do so great at creating spaces where the conversation I do far better with you. I'll say Saturday, Sunday mornings whenever we talk. I mean, I think we get knee deep in this, but I'm more and more now starting to think about how to play a part in creating a space where a conversation like you and I had right here can then make it in real life. So in a space within the school, because I come back to kind of where I scribbled down here, how does your local culture define you? So the school that you're in, do you feel, and this is the big sort of beefy equity question, but do you know that your local culture isn't defining you, that you're able to self-define as a teacher, as an educator, and that you can have space in that culture, that community, to develop that? And that would be a really cool conversation to have, or an exploration, or a survey. I don't know.
The one thing about this podcast is that there are too many ideas to work with. Like at the end of our last podcast on the off ramp, you and I had a great discussion about some learning that you were involved in. And the big plan was that we were going to talk about it this week, and we haven't even touched it. So it's kind of cool to know that we've got these ideas that we would love to kind of explore and talk about and work through. And we just don't have the time, which sucks in a way, but it's also kind of refreshing to know that there's more going on than just one or two things in our little brains, right? Like we've got a lot of stuff going on, a lot of learnings happening. Like if you think about you are in a situation where you're knee deep in a particular type of learning formally, and then I've got some stuff on the side that I'm just kind of mulling over and trying to work through. Anyway, I like that. I like that we've got a lot. It's too bad we can't get to it. Like I think we still have items from the New Year's stuff that we just gets getting pushed aside, right? So I don't know. I like that. I think we had a great conversation. I'm going to be thinking about code switching all week. I'm going to be thinking about how I would identify myself at particular times of the day this week when I'm at school working with the students. I'm going to be that's my homework for the week, to kind of be aware. What am I doing right now? Why am I doing what I'm doing? And is it a newer tool, or is it an older tool that's been around for a long time that I'm using at this moment in time, right? And to look around and see what my colleagues are up to, and how they might identify themselves It's good stuff. It's food for thought, and I'm looking forward to taking some of it in.
Maybe next week. Yeah. Here's the one thing. So just for any, I'm taking an ASL class, so American Sign Language. We're at the midpoint. We're at the break. Sorry, break. And one of the things that has emerged from this, and even though I didn't get a chance to speak directly to this, here's the segue, let's say, coming out of it. Here's the segue out of a conversation that we never had, which is sometimes what's magical about you and I talking about these things. It leads back to, and this is what we chatted quickly about on the off-ramp of last week's, was how complex I have suddenly found myself feeling in learning ASL. And this whole conversation that we had today around how do you self-identify as a teacher is still, it doesn't, I think we were still talking from teacher perspective. And if we make teacher perspective or teacher power or teacher position, and you put it sort of into a cloud or a category, I think we were trying to self-define as in, if we're getting to the edge of that cloud and overlapping with, let's say, the student, somewhere in that overlap, we're both learners, but still maintaining, I think, positional power. I think that's part of my honest interpretation on it. Even if you say lead learner or co-learner or guide on the side, we're still suggesting that if you're taking, like, we don't often say that the student is the guide on the side. It's still that we're talking about how do we soften the teacher / educator position such that we have a better vibe in the class, let's say. Okay, so in the ASL class, where the overlap is, here is that me taking this course, I'm constantly hyper aware of a sense of like inadequacy to learn this content. Constantly. It never leaves. It's triggered from the moment that I pull into the parking lot. It almost stops when I walk out of the class. And I hate the feeling. I've come to understand the necessity of this medicine, though, because it's given me an entirely, if I define myself as an educator, then I automatically step into a whole list of superpowers that, for the most part, have been given to me. There's a lot of assumed kind of tools that I get if I decide to stay in the sage on the stage, guide on the side cloud, right? I have access to none of those in this learning. I have entirely flipped into a student mode, and in a student mode that I feel like the tools that I have for learning are not working. So one of the conversations that I think I take from this, not to, because I don't want to push too far through our hour together, is that your community can define who you are as the teacher. The culture, that space that you walk into, can say, we are all educators here. And it only takes the administrator or the leader, that's just the leader, to identify the whole group or categorize the whole group. And then that sets forth an expectation of behavior. Like the words, like the gendered nouns, it creates thought. It changes how we see ourselves. It changes how we see our educational world. So when I'm in this space and I'm learning ASL, what I can't do is tap into any of the automatic assumptions of learning. So what happens here is that I'm asking myself, why is it that I think I should be able to use the tools, my regular tools, to learn ASL? Why is it that I just keep missing, like I just keep not noticing why I'm not learning well? It's entirely an emotional experience. And the third part, it makes me think in the bigger sense is my learning defined by the context that I learn in? And one of those conversations that I've been in the past is where I'll say specifically where I've heard math and science teachers saying, well, I can't do these open-ended kind of inquiry things because that's not math. Which I won't agree or disagree. I don't know. I don't teach it well enough or broad enough to sort of know if the content decides the pedagogy. But that's something that I'm constantly made aware of in this ASL class, that I staying open to my deficit, what I feel is a deficit, so that I can I can sort of figure out how I need to improve. Now, parts of it are simple. I need to practice more, sure, but that's kind of like, there's still an element of I feel the herd moving ahead. I'm not quite out of the herd yet, but I feel like the herd is moving ahead without me. I'm just clinging to the second half and hoping that I make it through, and letting go of the fact that I should pass this course, or even get a good mark. I've embraced the fact that I might have to take this course again. So
what I want to thank you for that. Thank you for explaining your position. I didn't want to force you to talk about your ASL course, but I did want to throw down that we wanted to talk about that, because for me, what I really am taking away from your experience is that really shitty feeling you have going into the learning that you're going to do, and the fact that you're still staying with it. Like, and we don't need to get into this now, but I have no idea what your motivation is to learn any of this. You probably told me and I wasn't listening to you, but which my wife could say I'm really good at. I don't know what your motivation is, but whatever your motivation is, or your drive, let's say, I'm going to go Goggins on you here without all the swearing. Whatever is driving you to learn this material, to learn this content, is so strong that you're pushing past all the negative feelings you have about your learning, your inadequacy, all that package that you feel when you pull into the parking lot at your course. That's for me the golden nugget. That is life, because I've come to learn that nothing in life worth doing is really easy. So there's something about you doing this. You know it's difficult. You don't feel good. You don't feel like harmony. These are just my words. And yet you go back every week. You don't even know if you're going to pass. But it sounds like to me you've gotten past that. I don't even know how to say it. You've gotten past that that little token of getting your piece of paper at the end that says you were successful. You're like, I'm here to learn this stuff. I'm not really sure how to learn this stuff. I'm struggling with it a lot. And I may not even be successful as in passing the course, but you're still sticking with it. You're still doing it. And maybe it's not appropriate to talk about what's driving you, because it's none of anybody's business. But there are only, there's only like a few things in my life that I can say to you. I can connect to what you're saying about the difficulty, but there's a drive. There's more. It's more than motivation to do something or to learn something. And for me, that's the nugget. For me, when you talk about this, when you talked to me about it last week, it's not learning ASL that's got me hooked on your story. It's that everything in your soul tells you to stand away and step away. And yet there's one thing within you that says, I'm not leaving. And it's so friggin' strong that you go through this torture. Again, my words, not your words. You go through this torture every week, and it's haunting you every week. Like, it doesn't leave you. But wow, if you could bottle that, if you could figure out how to sell that one thing, that beyond motivation thing, you'd be loaded. You'd be done for life in terms of financial.
Yeah, and there's no, for me, I love that we can spend time hashing it out. There's no, for me, there's, no big, not that you're suggesting this, there's no big brag in it. I think it just becomes one of those very real aha moments that, and I have few things to compare it to as well, where I've actually pushed through. There's just something that's cued in here where I want to make sure that I maximize this experience. And yeah, I don't somehow that I'm doing something that anyone else could or couldn't do. It's just, this is just a really fascinating self-thought experiment. And it's stripping me of a lot of assumptions in a very simple way. we hit the midpoint, and there was another student that has had tears. So where I'm in my frustration, they've taken it one step further, and they feel a little bit broken by it. And people are feeling it. People are feeling the actual learning, and everyone is authentic and intentional and intense in their own way. So observing myself in this has become, it'll be interesting to see how I feel when I no longer have the class to practice this. So how does it echo through my life when I'm not specifically in the classroom? Because right now it's a lot of reflective practice, but after this, it'll have to be the practice. So.
Right on. Well,
all right, man.
Maybe next week we can crack it open a little bit more. We'll have to see what comes. But again, another great chat with Chris Clough, host of Chasing Squirrels podcast. I love throwing that stuff down every now and again. Just that whole, I don't know what to call it.
Is that a bumper? You just throw in the first bumper?
I guess. Welcome to the Decoded podcast with Christopher Clough, host of Chasing Squirrels, and Roland Chidiak, who no longer hosts his own podcast.
It's all, hey, you get to self-define. This space is safe. Call yourself what you will.
Hilarious. Okay. Well, have a good one, and we'll be in touch soon.
Absolutely.
See ya.
Adios.